Something has been poking at me for a while now. With every SpongeBob game I look at, the line earnestly marches forward, waiting for their chance. But one seems to be too good to wait on anymore. A certain entry in the Sponge's solidified gaming lineage has been pushed, carried, and thrown up to the front spot by so many people. So, why wait any longer? Well, it's time. For those of you not in the know, I partially started this channel because a new SpongeBob game was coming out that I was very, very excited for. A full-blown remake of one of my childhood favorites that has remained one of my top fagotes, Battle for Bikini Bottom. More than 2 years later, and we're within 2 months of the next big SpongeBob game coming out, Cosmic Shake. In that time, I've covered nearly every big SpongeBob game that the fanbase tends to bring up. From the incredibly humble Revenge of the Flying Dutchman, to the iconic Heavy Iron trilogy, to the enjoyably different Lights, Camera, Pants. I'm gonna jump on Cosmic Shake as soon as it comes out. You already could have guessed that. But there's still one big SpongeBob game left to cover. Well, that people actually seem to like. That being 2006's Creature from the Krusty Krab. And let's just say this game is quite the interesting specimen to examine both from a distance and up close. This is another SpongeBob game I never played prior to the playthrough I did for this video, but unlike Truth or Swear, I was very much aware of this one's existence even as a kid. The advertising this game got was pretty aggressive, and the imagery definitely stuck. Plankton was this giant monster destroying Bikini Bottom, and SpongeBob was trying to both fight and evade him in a plane. It was pretty cool. And let's be real, considering the commercials that mainly just showed off these two elements and the box art, the devs really wanted us to think it was cool. Despite that, and already owning a GameCube and later on a Wii, I never got around to getting the game. Not because of disinterest, but just because between those two consoles, there were already so many games I had my sights on. As a kid, I had to carefully choose the one I wanted for my birthday or Christmas, and I was often just aiming for the first-party Nintendo releases, with a couple exceptions here and there. I also think I had the mindset of, I already have 3 SpongeBob games I really like, so do I really need a 4th? Which does seem really silly in hindsight, but hey, I was a kid back then. But that was then, and this is now, and I gotta say, I'm curious to see how this one turns out. The general consensus I picked up for Creature was that it was among the most beloved games in the Sponge's lineup, but that it also gets the most pushback compared to other popular SpongeBob games like Battle or the movie game. I think the most telling case was this Watch Mojo video ranking the best and worst SpongeBob games. Creature was put as the number 5th worst, and I'm pretty sure more than half of the top rated comments are just people either expressing their enjoyment for that game or wondering how it ended up in the bottom 5. Though, being totally honest, considering this video also has Revenge of the Flying Dutchman in the top 5, and both the infamously hated Activision games somehow avoided the bottom 5, I think we can all agree this isn't a particularly credible video. But throwing that aside, I've seen some other negative takes on this game from time to time, but the overall reception still seems to be fairly positive. The other thing that has me curious are the people behind it. The game was published by THQ as usual, but was developed not by Heavy Iron, but Blitz Game Studios, and their resume is quite the interesting one. You might know them for making the only 2 Fairly Odd Parents games on home consoles, Breaking the Rules and Shadow Showdown. You might know them for making the trio of Burger King advertisement games, including the meme that is Sneak King. You might even know them for making Glover all the way back in 1998, back when they were called Interactive Studios. I'll admit Glover and the Fairly Odd Parents games give me some optimism, but most of the rest of their resume is just easy, bland, license game stuff. Mostly based off kid shows and game shows. I wish I could say the dev team behind the games for series like iCarly, Bratz, Biggest Loser, and Are You Smarter Than a 5th Grader filled me with more confidence, but it doesn't. They also made Karaoke Revolution, which is only worth mentioning because the most notoriety this game ever got was getting dissed in that one Scott the Woz Christmas episode. Blitz Games were also involved in a few other SpongeBob games. Creature was their first, but they went on to work on Atlantis SquarePantis, Underpants Slam, and Surf and Skate Road Trip. None of which seemed to be liked very much, so yeah, maybe I should stop looking at this list. The point is, regardless of background info or the general reception, I'm more than happy to give Creature from the Krusty Krab a fair and balanced review. And I guess I'll mention right here and now that I'm playing the Wii version. I know that alone is going to make a lot of fans of this game concerned, as the Wii version gets a lot of shade thrown at it for the forced motion controls, but I'm going to be pretty gracious with it since it was a Wii launch title. I will be cross-referencing my Wii playthrough with a GameCube playthrough just to see how the controls differ though. The Wii version definitely looks a whole lot nicer than either the PS2 or GameCube versions, and it's worth noting that the Wii version is way more accessible these days and vastly cheaper than the other versions. So yeah, the Wii version has its positives, and I'm prepared to handle the motion controls head on. I will be critical if they are really that bad, but them being mandatory on its own isn't really a damning fault for a Wii game. Alright, I think I covered all my bases, so let's just get into it. This is a retrospective of SpongeBob SquarePants, Creature from the Krusty Krab. So, what's the story this time? A better question would be, what wasn't the story? I'll tell you, boring. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and throw up a spoiler warning for this game. It seems a bit silly to do that for a SpongeBob game that's old enough to drive, but in comparison to games like Battle of the Movie Game, Creature's plot isn't nearly as predictable or one note. Again, I feel like most people watching this have either played the game themselves at this point or just don't care, but if you want a fresh playthrough and want the game to surprise you, I'd recommend pausing and watching something else till you get around to playing it. Okay? Okay. So, taking place in the dreams of our three playable characters, the story is a conga line of fever dreams and sudden shifts in both perspective and scenery. SpongeBob starts off by dreaming he's an extreme edgy race car driver, which eventually leads to him falling off a cliff and getting swallowed by an Alaskan bullworm, leading him to team up with Old Man Jenkins to finish a plane he's working on to escape the worm and their imminent deaths by Vor. Patrick dreams about being the heroic Starfish Man facing off against the dreaded Patrick and his minions. One failed hostage rescue later, and Starfish Man is sent flying into space strapped to a rocket, desperately trying to find his bearings and get back home. And Plankton has a nightmare of being pursued by a giant mutated Krabby Patty before the chased becomes the chaser, as Plankton uses a machine to grow to a building-sized monster to get back at the Patty, demolishing most of Bikini Bottom in the process. If you couldn't tell, that's a lot going on, and there isn't really a singular focus in the storyline, but honestly, I think it works out in its favor. On a conceptual level, this story, and by extension, the whole game, is probably the most varied and interesting of all SpongeBob games, and because the levels always rotate from SpongeBob to Patrick to Plankton, it means that, on paper, there's never any monotony, and you're consistently jumping to brand new levels with their own unique miniature storyline, location, and tone. Beyond that, there's plenty of other positives. Most obviously, we have our first time where Plankton is both playable and plays a starring role in the story. Sure, he's always been around, and has been the main antagonist a good portion of the time, but he's always either intentionally kept himself on the sidelines, like in BFBB or TOS, or he just doesn't get much screen time like in the movie game. Here, he's just as major a player in this game as SpongeBob and Patrick, and his sections are easily my favorite from a story perspective. SpongeBob and Patrick just get to live out their fantasies in their first sections before all hell breaks loose, and both need to survive horrific circumstances in their following levels. Plankton, meanwhile, has to earn his power fantasy, resigning himself to a deliciously ironic cat and mouse chase with the very food he swore to steal now trying to crush him flat. It takes a while, but he finally gets what he always wanted. Size. You remember Season 1's Sleepy Time, an episode where SpongeBob visited all the other characters' dreams? It's a fun episode and a creative way to showcase the dreams of our favorite Bikini Bottomites, but what's the bit everyone remembers from that episode? Okay, besides that. Aside from that. There we go. Yeah, in a fairly creepy moment by this show's standards, we see that Plankton's ideal dream consists of him demolishing Bikini Bottom, crushing and killing everyone he's ever met just because he can. It's a good reminder that Plankton is genuinely evil and why it's such a relief that in reality, he's often on the back foot. Now imagine that, but it's fleshed out to be an entire level, and yeah, it's pretty awesome. I love when video games make their villains fully playable in canon scenarios. Making your villains playable in a spin-off or kart racing game is neat and all, but I love when we get to really experience what it would be like as the villain of the story, if only because it helps to make clear what they're capable of. I want to do more stuff like wreck shit as Shao Kahn or blow up military bases as Dr. Eggman, and Plankton's atomic-powered assault on the city is definitely in that same vein. In terms of characters utilized for this game, things have definitely been scaled back. Obviously, we've got SpongeBob, Patrick, and Plankton, but a lot of the others you'd expect are almost entirely gone. Squidward and Mr. Krabs are only mentioned, Sandy gets a small silent cameo. We do get some small appearances from characters like Mrs. Puff and Mermaid Man, but they only appear for a level each, and even then, they don't appear often. The only characters who appear more than a couple of times throughout the game are the French narrator, Old Man Jenkins, and Karen, and they're fine. Again, I appreciate them being here, but it does kind of show how most of the screen time is being fallen into our main three. That brings us to the actual writing and the comedy, and it's fine. It's pretty middle of the road out of every SpongeBob game I've played. There's some genuinely really funny moments, most of them coming from Plankton, but about as many attempted jokes fall flat either because they have a really obvious punchline or just aren't very funny to begin with. A good example is this bit in the Alaskan Bullworm level. SpongeBob is helping this inventor guy find some power cells to power some invention of his in exchange for a propeller. The inventor keeps talking about how this is the coolest, most insane invention you'll ever witness and how it'll totally amaze you, and I was thinking, the invention's going to be something completely mundane, isn't it? And yeah, turns out it just makes the perfect cup of tea. SpongeBob's reaction could have saved it if it was played up properly, but no, he's just so nonchalant about the whole thing. The character interactions aren't doing much to help either with how few there are. I will say I like the talks between Old Man Jenkins and SpongeBob, but characters like Karen and Mrs. Puff are almost entirely there to exposit or give tutorials, which isn't exactly great. And because SpongeBob, Patrick, and Plankton's levels are so segregated, they obviously aren't talking with each other, which kinda stinks. Credit where credit is due though. During the Supersized Patty levels loading screens, the French narrator gets some pretty good lines.
Bikini Bottom has many sites of historical importance. There's that place with the thing, and there's that other thing, and oh, who am I kidding?
One of the funnier moments in the game for sure. Okay, I just remembered the other early bit I found way too funny to not bring up, so I'm just gonna bring it up while it's fresh in my memory. The first Patrick level is great for a lot of reasons, but I can't get over how everyone in this comic book town not only looks like Patrick, but literally every single one of them talk like Patrick. From Starfish Man himself, to the villain, to the mayor, to all the townsfolk. I completely understand that a lot of you are hearing me say that and are thinking that sounds like a recipe for the most annoying part of a game, a level where everyone talks like the dumb character. I was worried too when I realized what I was going to be in for, but I genuinely just found myself amused the whole way through. I just kept picturing Bill Fagerbakke in a recording booth talking to himself, and it made me laugh. Also, I've got to mention that Starfish Man keeps getting his tutorials from these phone booths, and at one point, we hear Starfish Man call his helper Phone Guy.
Hello, Phone Guy!
Did SpongeBob predict Five Nights at Freddy's? Oh, absolutely not. It's just a hilarious coincidence. But it still automatically makes this game the most epic SpongeBob game to ever exist. Truly inspirational. Getting back on track though, the biggest boom in this game's story is, of course, the final third. As mentioned, Plankton has been rampaging around Bikini Bottom, causing all sorts of carnage and destruction. Really cool stuff. Out of nowhere though, SpongeBob makes a surprise entrance and the Patty ends up jumping to his plane in order to keep away from Plankton. What follows is the classic B-movie plane versus giant monster chase and fight throughout the ruined city. Plankton eventually gets the upper hand when Starfish Man finally shows up after his adventures in deep space. And then we get our final boss fight, where Starfish Man proves his skill, might, and courage against the giant Plankton, mopping the floor of his henchmen, summoning the remaining Bikini Bottom military to pester and distract him, utilizing the environment to land some big hits and counterattacks, and ending it by wielding a shrink ray to put Plankton back to his proper height. This final third genuinely kicks ass. Even if there isn't a real focused plot structure or consistent goal, this does a great job at both creating a conflict in a short time frame and actually making it compelling. And it's pretty funny too.
This news just in. The plucky Starfish is making his final stand against the colossal might of the...
Do you mind? We're trying to have a titanic battle here!
Sorry, we'll try and keep it down.
Helping that this is where we get most of our good character banter, since SpongeBob, Patrick, and Plankton are finally in the same place. I love that Patrick is totally willing to throw down with Plankton the moment he sees SpongeBob in danger. That's a trait I always love seeing from him. And that's on top of the novelty of a Patrick versus Plankton boss fight. And of course, there's the inevitable question, how the hell are these three's dreams colliding? Is only one character dreaming all this up, or is something else weird happening? It's a good bit of intrigue that the final level does manage to partially use well, but it also kind of flops at the finish, but I'll get to that way later. I talk about the voice acting, but it's the voice acting of a SpongeBob license game. You think it'd be bad? You think we haven't done this song and dance 5 times already? Well, we did, but I do have a couple points worth bringing up. Obviously, with the character cast being significantly reduced from previous projects, getting the voice actors for this game was pretty easy. Tom Kenny, Bill Fagerbakke, Doug Lawrence, Mary Jo Catlett, and Jill Taylor are here playing their respective characters and do great work as usual. The few gaps in the original voice cast this time are Mermaid Man, voiced again by Joe Alasky, Old Man Jenkins, voiced by Tom Kenny, and the realistic Fishhead, voiced by Jim Ward. Despite that, I'd say this game is right up there with the movie game and LCP for how unintrusive and consistently enjoyable the voice work is in spite of the imperfect voice cast. As I mentioned in the LCP video, Joe Lasky is a genuinely talented voice actor who does really well as Mermaid Man. Old Man Jenkins does kind of get a pass for me since that name does apply to several different fish throughout the show, one of those fish being voiced by Tom Kenny, so I can look past it easily enough. And even if it's not his usual performer, Jim Ward is such a natural fit for the realistic fish head that I don't mind it at all. He's got plenty of other notable roles under his belt, including Captain Quark of Ratchet and Clank fame, but the one that's most relevant to this game is Chet You Betcha from the Fairly OddParents. So the voice actor for Charismatic Newscaster was a great pick for voicing another fellow charismatic newscaster. Who would have guessed that? One more thing to note is that there are a handful of lines that are taken from other SpongeBob games, mostly from Plankton. It didn't really bother me, but I questioned why they needed to copy off others when it was only a handful of lines. Were the writers really struggling to come up with a few more quips and they just desperately needed something? Again, not a big deal, and at least everything they took was contextually relevant. I just thought I'd mention it. Overall though, the story is definitely one of those game's most defining elements in a good way. There's tons of fun concepts at play that we've never seen in a SpongeBob game before or since, and it's further assisted by the mostly good writing, a surplus of memorable moments, and the solid voice cast. Moving on, we can discuss the visuals, and well, this game certainly has visuals. So as I've covered before, most SpongeBob games aren't exactly lookers thanks to subpar graphics at best and damnation at worst. And this might just be the most egregious case yet. Gonna be blunt, this game is pretty ugly. I can recognize that the Wii wasn't exactly famous for its cutting edge graphics, but there were still some really good looking games on that console, even from the very start. This isn't one of them. To be fair, I wasn't expecting something on the level of Truth or Square since that game was made a few years after this one and was likely developed for the Xbox 360, a proper HD console, and then toned back a bit for the Wii. But I was expecting something better than the games developed solely for 6th generation consoles made a few years back. And speaking for myself, not only do I think Creature failed to live up to that standard, but I think it somehow looks worse than something like Battle of the Movie game. Those games were also far from the peaks of what a game could look like at the time, especially on the technical side, but they managed to pull through thanks to utilizing the show's visual style and color palette to make the games look as appealing as possible. The real difference here is that almost every location used in this game doesn't really open up any possibilities for interesting or colorful aesthetics. That issue was also in the movie game to some extent, but it's even more prevalent here. We start in this Ed Roth-inspired Bikini Bottom, and unsurprisingly, it's designed exactly like his art style. You know, the Ratfink decals and cars. If you know, you know. But that just makes the characters look grotesque and the environments very drab. There's a level inside the Alaskan bullworm, so of course we get a palette of sickly reds, yellows, and greens, really appealing while you're eating, that I can tell you. There's one in space, which is a level in space. It's got some neat effects, but that aside, it's definitely no Mario Galaxy. And the levels in Bikini Bottom are just kinda okay. The lighting during the nighttime levels in the final third are really nice and do help it stand apart from other Bikini Bottom levels from other games, but that's all I can say. The backgrounds are dull with very little detail, and even then, certain elements can have rough edges and just look very thrown together at the last minute. A lot of stuff in this game looks pretty rough, and I can pinpoint some of the blame on the reused elements from previous games. I'm just assuming that THQ allowed Blitz to use things from previous SpongeBob outings like the Heavy Iron games because a whole lot in the game looks very familiar. The buildings, the level geometry, and the characters. Oh my god, the characters. So SpongeBob, Patrick, and Plankton have suspiciously similar models to the ones from the Heavy Iron games, but honestly, those don't bother me. They're animated differently, have different movesets from before, and Patrick in a superhero costume does prevent the playable characters from looking too samey, which I do appreciate. But the same cannot be said for the background fish because we have the extras from Battle, but they look even worse with super low poly models and very stiff animation, if you're lucky. Like, did they run out of time on some of these guys? And the cutscenes are a mixed bag. Again, the actual writing for a lot of these cutscenes is solid and got some laughs, but the presentation isn't really doing anything to help. There's very little in the way of good visual comedy, and the slapstick is almost entirely gone, a very clear downgrade from the cutscenes in the movie game and LCP. The way the characters move is fine, but there is a fair share of clipping and some other oddities to be found. Not the worst, but nothing really stand out either. And is it just me, or do these cutscenes have this awful blurry filter over them? It just further adds to the ugliness, and there were points I genuinely didn't want to look at the screen because of how bad it got. Oh, and you gotta love these in-game cutscenes where everyone converses like they're in a PS2 Ratchet game, or I don't know, Sonic Boom. That said, I do think the visuals have some positives worth mentioning. For one, the art design for the game is genuinely amazing, probably my favorite from any SpongeBob game I've played. I may not like how the graphics and color palette make the final product look, but the underlying designs they were going for were great, and definitely the most varied of any SpongeBob game. I already mentioned the Ed Roth-inspired first level, but then we've got levels based off of comic books, B-horror films, and a fair amount of extraneous bits thrown in for good measure. I think what they were going for is best shown off in the loading screen transitions. More on this later, but I don't exactly love how many individual segments are in every level that constantly forces you back into loading screens, but the saving grace is being able to look at these lovingly crafted, hand-drawn screens that perfectly encapsulate the genre, tone, and style that the level is going for. Not all of them are amazing, but most of them are just so damn cool to look at. Like, I would totally get some of these as posters if I could. As mentioned before, the playable trio are definitely the highlight as far as good character models and animations go in this game. SpongeBob and Patrick feel distinct from their previous playable appearances as far as how they look and move, and there are plenty of nice visual touches that do add up. I love how Starfish Man changes costume each time he uses his spin attack, I like how SpongeBob's arms wrap around himself every time he uses his spin attack, and I really love the contrast in how Plankton runs in his two levels, going from a panicked sprint to a monstrous yet confident stomp. And credit where credit's due, not all of the levels look bland. The Bikini Bottom levels are decent and do enough to stand out from other games' takes on Bikini Bottom. The final level embraces the darkness with a nightmare-themed racetrack, which looks really cool and has plenty of bizarre set pieces. And without question, my favorite level based on looks is the first Starfish Man stage that goes for a cel-shaded comic book approach. It's very reminiscent of the way the Crimson Chin levels looked in those two Fairly Odd Parents games I brought up, and they're all great. The solid colors really make the city pop, I really like the black sketchy outlines on the characters, and the simple textures that make it up allow it to age pretty well unlike the rest of the game. It's one of the best examples of simplistic yet colorful aesthetics paving over lackluster graphics I've come across in any SpongeBob game yet. I would have loved if all of Starfish Man's stages had this look to them, but you know, whatever, at least we got it for one. All in all, the visuals are right at below average. Maybe I expected too much, but to me this game often just flops between looking basic and looking kinda scuffed. It's definitely not devoid of good-looking levels or nice creative touches, but it isn't enough to combat the rest. I'd still say Revenge of the Flying Dutchman is the ugliest SpongeBob game I've looked at so far, but let's be real, that's a pretty low bar to clear. Next up is the music, and dang, you know what? This is a surprisingly great soundtrack. I was definitely hoping for quality considering the game had three composers, John Guscott, Matt Black, and Todd Baker, all of which seemed to be regular composers for Blitz around that time, and it thankfully delivered. Much like the game it's a part of, this soundtrack is a fever dream that's constantly changing things up and doesn't have much of a consistent through line. It's more of an excuse to experiment with all sorts of music, and I'd say it works out in its favor. The song for the title screen that you got to listen to in that opening montage is just about the perfect way to introduce this game. It starts with a nice, gentle rendition of the SpongeBob theme song before devolving into pure chaotic madness. The panicked rush of the instrumentals feel like you're descending down Alice in Wonderland's LSD rabbit hole in what will likely be one of the craziest adventures in SpongeBob's career. It's the perfect perversion of the show's iconic theme, and definitely my favorite title screen song for any SpongeBob game yet. Past the opener, this soundtrack is stacked with all the variety you'd expect it to have. Rock, jazz, techno, orchestral, with a few other oddballs thrown in for good measure. One thing I appreciate out of the gate is how each of the main 3D platforming stages have their songs shift tempo, volume, and total instruments used based on the context, with an idle version, a standard version, and one that plays for big combat encounters or other action set pieces. I always respect when the composers bother to make dynamic soundtracks, even in this case when it's only for a few levels. Beyond that, this soundtrack is packing plenty of bangers that I'd say stand toe-to-toe with Battle in the movie game soundtracks. Starfish Man to the Rescue's battle theme sounds like something out of The Incredibles. It nails that classic superhero theme motif right out of the park. Supersized Patty remixes the Grass Skirt Chase theme from the show, and it's a joy to listen to. It really works well considering the level it's used for, and it has 3 variations to boot. Most of the Alaskan Belly Trouble tracks do really well, but I have to give special mention to the idle versions because they're some of the creepiest tunes I've heard from any licensed game. They sound incredibly hopeless, and since you have to be idle to hear them, it can almost be interpreted as SpongeBob giving up and just waiting for death. Rocket Rodeo has not one, but 2 of the best tracks in the game, with the first half of the flight being an energized marriage of western and techno that does a great job at perking you up after the last level. And damn guys, they didn't have to go so hard for this one-off meteor minigame at the halfway point, but I'm so glad they did. Revenge of the Giant Plankton Monster and It Came from Bikini Bottom feel right at home in your average B-horror sci-fi flick. They've got a War of the Worlds vibe to them, which is definitely unique for a SpongeBob game. And the Rooftop Rumble theme brings back that jazzy superhero music to great results. It's far from the most climactic final boss theme that SpongeBob has had, but being fair, if I was dreaming about being a superhero and saving the city, this is probably what would play in my head too. Anyway, I'm just rambling. Let's have a listen to some of these. To be fair, there are some tracks that I find forgettable and definitely get overshadowed amidst the awesome stuff. I think Diesel Dreaming's idle and standard versions are kinda dull for a first level theme and are only somewhat saved by the solid battle and racing theme. Rocket Rodeo 2 chokes real hard after the first half and its interlude warm up the crowd as well as they do. Some of the Alaskan Belly Trouble tracks kinda get lost in the shuffle, which makes sense since there's 9 of them. And the Snooze Z shop lives up to its name because it's one of the most boring shop themes I've heard from any game. Overall though, the soundtrack is great, and easily one of the game's greatest strengths. Its highs reach about as high as those from the Heavy Iron games, albeit not quite as consistently the whole way through. I'm half tempted to call it better than LCP's OST, but regardless, they're easily within swinging distance of each other. That leads us into the gameplay, and, well, I'm not sure where to start, because this game is simultaneously the hardest one to talk about so far, but also the easiest. For you see, Creature is often roped in with the Heavy Iron trilogy, the Activision duology, Revenge of the Flying Dutchman, and the upcoming Cosmic Shake as one of SpongeBob's 3D platformers, but that's not entirely true. It's more accurate to call it an everything in the kitchen sink platformer. Like many other licensed kids games at the time, Creature from the Krusty Krab, while more of a 3D platformer than anything else, is a variety show, constantly switching gameplay styles with 3D platforming, 2D platforming, racing, on-rail shooting, beat-em-up brawling, and more. Genre shifting in a game isn't anything new for me. I've already talked about the movie game after all, and I went into this game perfectly neutral about it. I definitely prefer a game with a strong core focus that builds upon itself over the course of the playthrough, but I'm also fond of alternate gameplay styles, provided they're fun in their own merits and don't stray super far from the game or series' main appeal. I think it's fair to say that there are some great games out there that do go for the variety, and a lot of those games work only as well as they do because of the variety they mix in. And if any SpongeBob game was absolutely begging for that, it's definitely the one that takes place in dreams where every other element of the game is getting tossed around with every level. So, why not? Let's see what they've got to offer. And since I don't exactly have a better idea on how to start breaking this down, I guess we can just start with the first level, Diesel Dreaming. And if I'm being 100% honest, this level had me really worried for what the rest of the game was going to be like. Let's just give this a proper rundown so you can see what I mean. Okay, so after our introductory cutscene, we get into a driving section where you have to do 3 laps around the track before time runs out. This is a Wii game, so of course you're using tilt controls to steer, but the course itself is incredibly simple with no sharp turns to speak of and no obstacles to get in the way. There are these boxes you can just crash right through without losing speed, and also don't give you anything for smashing them, so I'm not quite sure why they're here, but whatever. And hey, at least while I'm driving around I can snag these little shiny Z's on the track. These seem to be the main collectibles, so I might as well start getting as many as I can. It's an incredibly simple first section, but it's also the first part of the level, so I'm sure it's only trying to get our feet wet. We move on to a 3D platforming segment where we have to reclaim our driver's license that just keeps hopping away from us, cause I guess it's also scared of tilt controls. SpongeBob properly comments on these Snooze Z tokens and how he's gonna grab as many as he can, so okay, these are definitely the equivalent to shiny objects or mailiness points. You do a very brief series of jumps to show that, yes, I am capable of jumping. Twice no less. And then SpongeBob does a Fortnite dance. How quaint. And then we come to this crank, and we're instructed to use the Wii Remote to mimic turning it in order to raise the gate. Mrs. Puff even says,
"Turn it as fast as you can, boy! Work those crazy arms!"
which leads me to crank the Wii Remote like nothing else. Except it didn't work. No, unlike every other Wii game in existence, going as fast as possible for mundane motions like this doesn't work. No. You have to go at a very specific speed in order for the game to read it properly, and then the gate will actually start moving. Ask anyone else who's played the Wii version, and you'll hear the same thing every time. Okay, so that wasn't exactly good, but I'm sure there won't be too many of those in the future. So we move on, and... oh. Well, alright, I might as well make sure the information sticks. Turn the crank, and we can progress. And hey, we can even take a quick second to explore and find this weird Patrick gummy. Cool. Secondary collectibles. Always welcome in my book. Moving forward, we do some more simple platforming, and... okay, game. Really stepping it up. 2 inches right next to each other to open the same door. Sure. Turn them, and then we press on. We do some platforming where we actually have to dodge timed obstacles. That's a definite step up from the previous bits of platforming. There's a button we can press with our ground slam attack. We move forward and jump over a few streams of oil, and... come on, really? There have been more cranks to turn than actual platforming bits so far. We move on, and the last thing that needs to be done before grabbing our license is using our charge attack to knock this gadget into its proper place. And how do you do that? By shaking the nunchuck. The thing that's well known for not identifying motions even a fourth as well as the Wii Remote. I mean, it's just to solve a puzzle, so hopefully I won't need to rely on this on the fly. You see, the joke is what I'm saying isn't actually what's going to happen. But before the irony can poison me, we find ourselves in another driving segment, except we're now against this... demon. So we're actually having a proper race, right? Well, yes, but actually no. This section still operates on the checkpoint system as before, and all that matters is you crossing the finish line before time runs out. All Patrick can do is drop bombs that will slow you down a bit if you hit him, but they're not even that bad, so he's more of an annoyance than anything else. However, the track is cooler this time. Not only are there some actual speed boosts to assist, but the track will fall apart as the race goes on, with debris falling on the course and an entire building being carved open for a new path. So, yay for the more interesting racetrack, but nay for the fake opponent that barely matters and makes you realize this was just a glorified time trial. So we get back to the platforming, and this section is very combat focused. We learn about our basic spin attack, the Sand Slap, which does its job as well as any other spin attack in the series, and we beat up a bunch of basic mooks with no issue. This goes on for a short while until we stumble into these big fellas, and to beat them, we have to charge into their shields to stun them and then follow up with a spin attack. So yeah, the charge is necessary to fight certain enemies, and it only sometimes works, which kind of throws fair and balanced combat right out the window when you start taking damage because the charge fails to register or stops registering just before you hit the shield, leaving you close and completely vulnerable to one of their attacks. Besides that, this section just has you fighting more and more of these same 2 enemy types as you navigate these garages for new car parts. It's not challenging, not intentionally anyway, but I'm fine with this. 2 enemy types in the first stage is pretty par for the course in these games, and I'm sure we'll see many more later on. And another race, this time against Plankton on his Wario bike lookalike. And it's another disguised time trial where the opponent is more of a minor hazard than anything else. Sure, there's some extra crap on the track and another building falls to change the layout again, but at this point, you have this playstyle's number. It's super easy and you win with no issues. And another platforming segment. Sure. This one mainly just exists to put everything you've learned to the test. Not because it has harder platforming, or harder combat encounters, or harder puzzles, but just because it does pretty much the same thing again. The only new thing that gets introduced is the ability to swing on anchors to cross gaps. It's similar to Sandy's lasso and Patrick's tongue swinging from previous games, except less fun. Every set of anchors is always in a straight line, there's no moving anchors, the swinging itself feels super stiff with no momentum, and it can be hard to tell if you'll successfully grapple the next one just because they don't give you a cursor to let you know when an anchor is within reach, unlike previous games with this mechanic. Worse than that, this section not only refuses to do anything more complex with what you've learned so far, this long section makes the faults more obvious. Enemies, for instance, are rock bottom stupid, as many will often ignore you even when you're killing the guy right next to them. And for some reason, shielded enemies have to be charged no matter what. It doesn't matter if they're paying attention to you or not, if you sand slap one of these guys on their back, the game just doesn't care, which is always fun. This section also has more of those sliding gadget puzzles where you have to charge blocks into their proper place to move on. And by more, I mean holy crap, there are so many of these in this section that I already dislike them. And they're so patronizing too, like, yes, I know what direction to push these in thanks to the dirt trails on the ground. I don't need these neon bright arrows to treat me like an infant. Any person playing this game would understand where to push these, because the environmental clues did a good enough job as is. Whatever, we got through it, and another race. Whatever. This time against Gary, who, to be fair, has the coolest look of any of the characters in this art style so far. I'll give him that. But beyond that, it's just the exact same time trial and the exact same course. You can now use your own nitro boost that refill at checkpoints to help keep up the pace, but the game gives you so much time regardless that you don't even need them to win. And finally, to my relief, the first level was over. And it took around 40 to 45 minutes. Can you see why this first level had me worried now? Sure, on a conceptual level, this was a cool stage, and a no-brainer for one of SpongeBob's dreams. But in practice, this was just an incredibly basic first level, where the amount I learned and got to do doesn't at all match the amount of time I had to spend here. At 45 minutes, I'd already be past Jellyfish Fields in BFBB, or up to 3,000 miles in the movie game. And in both games, they would have already scaled up the difficulty a decent amount, and had me doing more than just beating time trials in what's essentially the same racetrack 4 times, and doing tutorial level platforming sections where the only thing that increases is the amount of cranks to turn, blocks to push, and easy enemies to beat up. The visuals were certainly distinct, but they weren't appealing, and when it wasn't ugly, it just failed to impress. And while I went into this video ready to tell you all the motion controls aren't actually that bad and people were just looking to complain, the nunchuck shaking and overly specific crank turning was a piss poor way to start the game off and really is just obnoxious after the first couple minutes. Needless to say, I was concerned, because this was just a straight up flaccid and boring first impression, but I pressed on with the hopes that the 3D platforming levels would improve and the variety would start coming in to help. Thankfully, the game did largely improve after Diesel Dreaming, but it definitely isn't free of issues. But I'm gonna stop doing play-by-plays as that would take too long, and instead start talking about the rest of the game in broader strokes. We might as well just tackle the rest of the 3D platforming since there's only 2 other levels to talk about, and they're fine. After Diesel Dreaming, I assumed the other levels would just be more diet BFBB or movie game platforming, and yeah, that was pretty much right on the money. Credit where credit is due, Starfish Man to the Rescue was a much better stage than Diesel Dreaming and did mostly set me at ease after what that first stage did. There's no driving for one thing, so it's 100% focused on the 3D platforming part, which I was fine with. The stage admittedly is nothing super special, it's still pretty easy, it still kind of drags on longer than it needs to, and the first section is all about teaching Patrick his abilities, and considering he and SpongeBob largely have the same moveset, it's a slow start that feels redundant. But the rest picks up fairly well. It does feel a bit meatier in both the combat and platforming, and there's not a crank nor shielded enemy to be seen, which I couldn't be happier about. Starfish Man can still charge, but it's entirely for destroying walls for puzzles or secret items, which was fine by me. He's got a cool multi-purpose blowing attack that's utilized for interacting with objects, activating fans, and defeating enemies. And the ending portion where you're storming the dreaded Patrick's lair and riding a giant elevator up to the hostage while beating up wave after wave of his goons is fairly enjoyable and got me invested. One thing that isn't so nice about this level are the quote-unquote puzzles, which largely apply to the whole game. This game doesn't have puzzles. It has painfully obvious buttons, cranks, or other interactable objects where you handle it the same way every time. The moment that made me come to that realization was the introduction of these numbered buttons, where the way to activate them is just to ground slam on it 3 times. Ooh, yeah, that's real stimulating. This is big brain time. I guess you could argue a lot of the buttons in the Heavy Iron games are the same way, but they usually did a better job at hiding them in little nooks and crannies, or just required some semblance of skill to hit, either because there were things that could get in the way, or maybe you had to do some involved platforming or combat to get to that button in the first place. That aside, this is a decent stage, which admittedly is somewhat carried by the stylish visuals, great music, fun setup, and the amusing interactions between Patrick and himself.
Hello, phone dude.
Hey, glad you came back for another night.
Alaskan Belly Trouble, meanwhile, kinda drags things back down. Mainly because of how long it is. This stage lasts around 50 minutes, if not an hour, and that's on top of these minigames they put between each section that go on for a minute and a half each. Like, of all the levels in this game that demanded to be the longest, what about this one really deserved it? though I did enjoy some things about it. The opening where you're free falling is easily the best part of the stage. It is just a one-off gameplay style, but it's used to great effect with solid pointer controls to guide SpongeBob through it all. It looks great too, with some really dazzling colors and a lot of themed caverns that are just fun to look at as you're falling through. And that fucking moment where that worm just comes in out of nowhere genuinely freaked me out a bit when I first played it, because I just didn't expect it. It could have stood to show up a bit more suddenly and maybe with a scare chord to really capitalize on the fear factor, but as it is, it's an effective ending to one of the most memorable set pieces in the game. And to be fair, this is easily the most challenging 3D platforming stage in the game. The combat really isn't much harder, save for some new projectile spitting enemies that you can often just run past, but the platforming definitely stepped up its game with much smaller and more narrow platforms, and the fact this one actually has bottomless pits. What a concept. But again, I need to stress this is the 4th level in the game and the final real 3D platforming level, and yet it feels no harder than something like Goo Lagoon or Downtown Bikini Bottom. And that's when the game is actually having you platform, of course. We can't forget all the cranks that are in need of turning. That's real cool. At this point I was fully used to the speed I needed to go to properly turn these, so there was no aggravation, but that doesn't mean they're good. Imagine if in Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword to open doors you had to use motion controls to mimic opening it instead of just pressing a button. Does that sound like fun? Yeah, well, that's what this is. Overall though, the 3D platforming levels are largely just meh. They're not the worst thing I've played, but they're so easy and yet they take so long to beat. I wouldn't be surprised if 50% of your playtime is spent in just these 3 levels, and because they're all within the game's first 4 stages, it means the pacing in this first half of the game is a genuine slog. That said, there is one level in the midst of all this 3D platforming mediocrity, and it really did give me what I wanted. Supersized Patty is Plankton's first level, and the one and only 2D platforming level in the game. It's also arguably one of the best levels in this game. In each of its segments, you'll constantly be chased by the mutated Krabby Patty. If it gets too close, it's an instant loss, and it moves a bit faster than you to boot. Plankton, meanwhile, can run, perform a double jump, and most importantly, has his trusty Despiculator.
It's just a freeze ray, dear.
I invented it, so I get to name it.
Regardless of its name, it's Plankton's saving grace during these chases, as it can destroy obstacles, freeze and kill jellyfish, and can even freeze the patty, albeit only for a couple seconds. This is just a well-made side-scroller that, while still not super challenging, it actually kept me tense and eager to stay as far away from the patty as possible. Because it's a 2.5D plane where the path isn't always a straight line, you can't always turn around to freeze the patty whenever you want. And those moments where you or the patty is about to change direction and yet you still manage to snipe it from far away are incredibly satisfying. There are some brief bits of motion controls where you have to use the Wii Remote like an air pump to blow balloons or move a platform forward, but unlike the numerous cranks and SpongeBob levels, I didn't mind it because I was feverishly doing it as that damn sandwich kept closing in on me. I was actually getting into it, not unlike the way, say, motion controls were utilized in Resident Evil 4's QuickTime events. And this easily has my favorite method for collecting Sleepy Seeds in the game. Sleepy Seeds are those Patrick and Plankton gummy looking things I brought up earlier. I realized I never found a way to properly introduce them beforehand, so just bear with me. These seeds are located at the end of each segment, and to gain access to it, you need to collect all parts and blueprints in that segment along the way. Many are just on the beaten path, but quite a few are out of the way, and some even require you to use the jellyfish you freeze to be spared and use platforms in order to jump to them. It's nothing incredible. It's about on the level of a star coin in a new Super Mario Bros. Game needing the ice flower to reach it, but these are the only legitimate puzzles in this game and actively discourage brainlessly spamming the shoot button, which I do appreciate. There are also some mini-games in between each segment where you're stealthing about, grabbing gear, and keeping a watchful eye on the patty for it when it wakes up. They're fine. In fact, that's all I can say for all the minigames. They're just fine. They don't really add anything beyond more variety just for the sake of it. The only one that actually bothers me is that junk sorting one in Alaskan Billy Trouble, just cause it's extra padding on a level that was already way too long, but the others I can tolerate. Like this one, yes, you have to do it 4 times, but at least it's for a stage that's only like 20 minutes long without them. The only thing they serve to do is just hand you even more snoozies, which still haven't been used for anything. There's no experience point system, no purchasable upgrades, not even a single toll booth in sight, so these things do seem pretty pointless. Overall though, Supersized Patty is a great time. This one 2D level is more enjoyable than certain entire 2D SpongeBob games, and honestly, it's so good and so ripe with potential that I can imagine this being the groundwork for its own game. I would totally buy a Plankton side-scroller where you'd have a diverse set of gadgets and weapons at your disposal while constantly being chased by various creatures or other characters. So yes, what I'm trying to say is that this is the Captain Toad of SpongeBob games. Let's just skip ahead to the other Plankton level, because it's another highlight, and seems to be one of the most popular levels in the game, that being Revenge of the Giant Plankton Monster. The objective is remarkably simple. Get to the end of each area as you chase down that Krabby Patty and destroy anything and everything that dares stand in your way. Be it buildings, mountains, or even the entire Bikini Bottom army, prove your superiority by crushing them. You can punch, stomp, scream out a mighty shockwave, and even shoot an atomic-powered eye laser, and they all work wonders in leveling the town and getting where you want. Now, if I wanted to be an asshole, I could talk about how this level falls in the same trap as other levels in this game, where the gameplay is super simple and the stage is pretty easy, but honestly, for this level, I can't say I care about that. This is a homage to old school monster movies like Godzilla, and I don't remember him having any difficulties destroying cities. There's not many games at the top of my head where you can do shit like this, so I think I can give this one a pass just for the concept, the novelty, and the sheer rush you get from destroying everything. And despite all the carnage, it's still one of the funniest stages in the game because 50 feet tall or not, Plankton's still Plankton.
Ticket, please. I'm a 50-foot atomic-powered plankton! You still need a ticket. Confound you! With your ticket booth and your unbending rules!
There's nothing deep about this stage. In Plankton's own words, this is just
some good old-fashioned mayhem.
And you know what? It completely delivers on that promise. It's just awesome. Easily one of the best levels in the game, and I can very much understand both why this is such a crowd favorite, and also why Blitz pushed Giant Plankton as much as they did in the advertising. From here, let's look at what happens right before and right after. The on-rails levels, Rocket Rodeo, and It Came from Bikini Bottom. To play these, you hold the Wii Remote upwards like a joystick and tilt it to move about. These are motion controls I actually like, and the wide margin for error that the stages provide means that they never bothered me. That said, I think these stages are still too easy for their own good. They play a lot like the linear levels of Star Fox 64, but with almost no enemies and if your aircrafts were made out of adamantium. Instead of your usual health bar, you have a fuel gauge that will gradually go down over time and will lose a decent amount if you take a hit. There's tons of fuel containers along the track though to keep you going, and these checkpoint gates will also top you off nearly every time. The issue is that while your allowances for screwing up are numerous, there's very little to actually screw with you in the first place. For the most part, you just need to weave around environmental hazards with only the occasional breakable object or jellyfish you need to shoot at. Rocket Rodeo attempts to have some big encounter at the end with this Krabby Patty UFO that'll actually shoot at you, but the attacks move so slow and can be destroyed by your own lasers, so it barely even registered in my head that this was a threat. It Came from Bikini Bottom is definitely the better of the two. The context and backdrop definitely adds a lot as you fly through a ruined Bikini Bottom while constantly being hunted down by Plankton, but Plankton actively attacks you throughout the level, and there are a few moments where I was actually caught off guard and took a hit. Still didn't lose, but hey, I had fun regardless. One thing I think these stages do pretty poorly are handling sleepy seeds. Putting finite collectibles on linear tracks that constantly force you to move forward is completionist kryptonite, and something I constantly see people bitch about, and while this game is far from the most egregious example, it's still an example nonetheless. Missing a sleepy seed in these levels means you have to replay it again if you're going for 100%. Again, not horrible, and it probably won't even happen too often, but when it does happen, it's just a lot of frustration. Overall though, these on-rails levels are decently fun. They could have stood to be more challenging, but Rocket Rodeo is still a welcome breath of fresh air after spending an hour in that damn worm, and It Came from Bikini Bottom does enough right for me to consider it one of my favorite levels in the game. Before I jump into the finale, and the other finale, let's talk bonus content and other extraneous notes. So from the main menu, we've got a fair amount to check out, starting with Sponge Band. And that was Sponge Band. Yeah, this was Wii Music before Wii Music existed, and it's not really my thing. It's a neat little distraction at best, but I can't imagine anyone spending more than 5 minutes on this. There's a Z Shop, which allows us to spend our Snooze Z tokens on extras like concept art, music, and some toggable cosmetics. While I do like when games include concept art or sound tests as unlockable extras, I'm not so keen on this game because this is the only use Snooze Zs have in the entire game. There really was no purpose to picking these up over the course of the adventure besides just bonus content that some people aren't even going to care about. I'd be more forgiving, but the game intentionally keeps what these tokens do very vague from the start. If the game was just upfront about what they did from the start, that'd be fine. People who care would go out of their way to grab as many as possible, and those who didn't could just ignore them and keep things moving. Maybe I'm just being mean, but collecting these Z tokens just has little satisfaction to it because it doesn't do anything for your gameplay experience and literally become worthless once you've unlocked everything. They're just lame when put up against the shiny objects, manliness points, happiness points, doubloons. fuck, even the collectibles from the Activision games. Thankfully, I've saved the best for last. From the main menu, you can play any minigame or chapter you want, whenever, provided you've already beaten it in the story mode. This is, without question, one of the best things about this game and raises my overall thoughts on the game quite a bit. If you have a favorite level or two you feel like replaying but don't feel like playing the rest of the game to get to them, then this is the option for you. And for me, getting easy access to the game's second half of decent to great stages without having to play the long, drawn-out 3D platforming levels is a big deal and helps to give this game some extra replayability. Anywho, let's move on to our last two levels. So, despite SpongeBob having Plankton at a disadvantage, the microscopic monster instantly turns the tables by duping the aerial sponge into getting close. SpongeBob's plane and the patty are in the palm of Plankton's hand, and it looks like our villain has finally won. That is, until Starfish Man quite literally rockets onto the scene. Plankton's destroyed the city, exterminated the military, he had SpongeBob on the run for most of their encounter, all that's left is a chubby pink starfish. Laughable, sure, but nonetheless the last person willing to stand in his way. We get our final boss, Starfish Man vs. Giant Plankton in Rooftop Rumble. As the one and only real boss in the game, Giant Plankton does his job pretty well. It's a multi-phase showdown which does a good enough job of testing all your 3D platforming and combat skills that just happens to get a lot of extra mileage from the spectacle, the music, and the character interactions. Each phase is pretty simple, just requiring you to beat up waves of Plankton's henchmen, press buttons, and occasionally bait Plankton's attacks to your advantage. Sure, the amount of direct combat between you and the kaiju-sized protozoa is pretty limited, but I think I can give that a pass. Much like the rest of the game, it is really easy. Hell, it's probably the easiest final boss I've talked about so far aside from the Flying Dutchman. But it doesn't bother me that much. It reminds me of a lot of 3D Sonic final bosses, where the actual gameplay is just kind of there and not really challenging or even all that fun, but every other aspect of it from both a presentation and storytelling standpoint is so well done and working overtime to still make it a satisfying climax and a memorable ending to the game. So yeah, Rooftop Rumble gets a thumbs up for me. It's no SpongeBob Steel Pants or King Neptune, sure, but I'll still gladly take this. If I did have to complain about one thing, I think it's strange that Plankton just lets go of SpongeBob off screen. At the start of the first phase, we see SpongeBob circling around the arena, which just doesn't fit. I think it's easy to infer from the dialogue and the mook rushes that Plankton is just humoring Starfish Man in this first phase. He's just standing there, waiting for his minions to finish the job, and only occasionally throws a car your way. It would have been cool if Plankton was still holding SpongeBob during the first phase, a bad throw ends up with him getting hit where he'd release the plane, and gets pissed off as a result. And that would organically lead to the following phases, where Plankton is taking things more seriously and attacks you directly a lot more. It's not a big deal as is, it's just something I would have done differently. After all this, Patrick finally lands a direct hit with Mermaid Man Shrink Ray, and Plankton's rampage has come to an end. And just in time as reality literally begins to fade around them. This scrumptious looking individual then gets to the bottom of this whole game by finding the connecting tissue between these three that's caused all these night terrors. Turns out all three had a Krabby Patty right before bed. Okay. Yeah, have I mentioned yet that this game is fucking weird? The group realize that they need to catch the patty if they want to wake up from this nightmare, and this leads us to the final level, Hypnotic Highway. Now, this stage to me is probably the most interesting to talk about, partially because it has unique strengths and weaknesses, and also because it's probably the single best level for showcasing how I feel about this game in general. Starting with the positives, the concept, as you'd imagine at this point, is good. Not even good, this is actually genius. The goal of this stage is to beat your fellow playable characters in a final race to see who gets to catch the patty and wake up. In a game that's entirely taken place in the world of dreams, the final level is a literal race through your own subconscious in order to awaken from this living nightmare. That's such an amazing idea, and it only makes me wonder if any other game has done something like this, because it would genuinely shock me if this had only been done once so far. In a SpongeBob game, no less. It might throw some people off that this doesn't end with a traditional final boss fight like every other SpongeBob platformer, but this works real well for this specific game. Not trying to sound pretentious, but thematically, this final stage is a natural fit, if that makes sense. It's also a great showing for this game's presentation. I already mentioned how cool this course looks earlier, but I didn't bring up the music that plays. It starts out pretty dark, slow, and sinister, but before long, things get fast and frantic. It sounds as if reality is falling apart around you as you're racing for your life. And when that electric guitar kicks in, that shit bangs. It's still energized, but sounds comparatively more in control, as if it represents our main trio, all starting to waver and buckle under the circumstances, but still managing to keep a grip on their sanity. No doubt from SpongeBob's optimism, Plankton's determination, and Patrick's Patrickness. I also have to bring up the bits of story this level drops along the way. We already know this is a race between SpongeBob and company, but as they race, they start talking to each other about who deserves to win and who's a part of whose dream. Again, further confusion on what's going on, except the characters are now fully aware and wondering what's up. And on the second lap, one of the commentators drops this line.
He certainly is, Rick, and that's because he knows that the prize for winning is this wondrous Patty Trophy.
And not only that, Dale, the only way this guy is gonna wake from his dream is by his victory on the track.
That sure is a tough break, Rick.
Yeah, it's a race to wake up, and the losers are basically damned to be trapped forever. It's just one moment, but it pushes the stakes just that slightest bit higher, and I really love that. Granted, a lot of this gets ruined by the ending, but at least on the first playthrough, it gets you thinking. So yes, this final level has an ingenious concept that fits like a glove, excellent music, good visuals, and adds a few more delectable sprinkles of intrigue to the story in the midst of playing it. But there's that dirty word. Playing. Yeah, there is actual gameplay in this final level, and it's just kind of whatever. If you've been paying attention, we haven't been racing since level 1. Let me repeat that. In the first level, we got 4 individual racing segments that were all piss easy, and in the following 7 levels, we never once revisited this gameplay style for even a single segment, let alone an entire level. So it's jarring to say the least when we're plopped back into it, where it's the last challenge the game throws at you before the credits roll. That aside, this race plays much like the ones from Diesel Dreaming. Despite being framed as a race, it's really just a time trial where you'll only occasionally see your opponents. Except this time, they won't even interact with you. I'd complain, but in reality, I'm happy with that because the actual time limit you get for this is pretty tight, to the point where just missing a boost pad or two or taking a couple hits is all it takes to dash your chances. And yeah, some of this is probably on the motion control's inevitable imperfections getting in the way, but I'm at least willing to accept some of the blame for just learning the course and getting used to the boost and obstacle locations as well as shortcuts. I actually lost multiple times before beating it, and while I did get aggravated for the difficulty spike, I was more just shocked that the game actually got harder after 8 stages of it just rolling over for me. The last thing worth mentioning are the sleepy seeds, because we finally see the use for them. If you manage to collect all of a certain type, you can play as their respective character in this final level instead. While I do appreciate that there is a collectible that actually has impact on the gameplay proper, they're not exactly worth it. For one, it's all or nothing. You need every seed to unlock Patrick and Plankton, which means a lot of level replays if you happen to miss a couple. And these seeds are in every level, including the final one. You have to play as SpongeBob no matter what on your first playthrough, and his course will have the remaining Patrick gummies. And Patrick's will have the remaining ones for Plankton, so there's not much in the way of player choice. The only thing you get by beating Hypnotic Highway is the other two are their respective endings, and as we're about to see, it literally doesn't matter. Overall, Hypnotic Highway is such a frustrating final stage. Not because it's bad or difficult, although the latter is true to some extent. It's because nearly every piece needed for this to be an awesome finale was there, but it got dashed by gameplay that, depending on who you are, is either boring or aggravating. It was so close to being a solid closer, but ends up being a disappointment compared to the previous few stages. And speaking of disappointments, let's talk about that ending. After winning the race, SpongeBob escapes his dream with the patty and he takes it to the Krusty Krab to feed the hungry mass of low-poly character models. But then we see SpongeBob has a shell, and so does everyone else. And then we get the big reveal that this dream wasn't SpongeBob's, Patrick's, or even Plankton's. No, it was Gary's. Now, to be fair, the big twist being that this whole game takes place in a completely different character's dream is probably the most logical answer this game could have given us. But it's also the lamest, least interesting option they could have taken. And this revelation comes after your first finished playthrough. And because this reveal spoils that what the characters do doesn't matter, you already know the other endings are non-canon, which would only serve to further deflate players' desires to collect the remaining sleepy seeds and play the other versions of Hypnotic Highway. Roll your eyes at me if you want, but to me, the game's ending would have been so much better if either A, it went for the "it was all a dream" or "was it" approach to keep the nature of the game and what really happened ambiguous, or B, there was no final ending at all, but kept the character endings. At least that way it leaves what really happened up to the player and whatever they imagine. Which, again, has more potential to be satisfying than just ripping the sheet off to show us that nothing in this game actually mattered and none of the characters had any actual agency in this story because it was dreamt up by someone else entirely. I know people are inevitably going to think, come on, Billy, it's a SpongeBob game. Are you really playing it for the story? And no, I'm not. At least not entirely, but a game that attempts to tell a story should have a good ending that matches whatever it's going for. That should be the ideal for any game, whether it be a AAA narrative-focused juggernaut or a humble little license game. And this ending is just too simplistic for the plot it was closing for, to the point where it just makes the rest of the story less interesting by proxy. It doesn't ruin the game for me, and I'd still say the story is one of the best parts of it, but the ending is a real sour spot, and easily the worst one from any SpongeBob game I've covered yet. Yes, even the one that was blatantly unfinished. Alright, before we finish this, I'll quickly just rank these 9 chapters, just in case anyone was wondering. From my least favorite to favorite, the order goes Diesel Dreaming, Alaskan Belly Trouble, Hypnotic Highway, Rocket Rodeo, Starfish Man to the Rescue, Rooftop Rumble, It Came from Bikini Bottom, Revenge of the Giant Plankton Monster, and at the top, Supersized Patty. And that about wraps things up. This was supposed to be like a 40-minute video, but the more I think about this game, the more I have to say on it. That's definitely one thing I'll give to Creature from the Krusty Krab. It is far from a boring game to talk about, and while there's plenty worth criticizing, I'd say there's even more worth praising. The soundtrack is amazing, with a handful of tracks that would give the Heavy Iron games a run for their money. The story is a lot of fun between the solid portion of jokes that land and the cool scenarios on display. And the gameplay, while a bit of a dice roll, does alright for itself more times than not. And above all else, I have the utmost respect for this game and Blitz Games for being so willing to be so different for their first spongy outing. After Heavy Iron Studios locked down such a great formula for their SpongeBob games, it really wouldn't be all that surprising if Blitz just decided to make the same kind of game BFBB was. Instead, they had new ideas. They experimented. They weren't afraid to do weird creative shit at the risk of alienating people. They did what they did for this game because they wanted to, because it sounded cool. And I dig that. Things like Giant Plankton or Patrick soaring through space on a rocket probably wouldn't happen if they played things safe and just copied Heavy Iron's style and format. And let's be real, if the 3D platforming levels we did get are any indication, an entire game of these would have been a lot worse off. Unfortunately, while I respect a lot of what this game does, not all of it works so well. The game just looks ugly, courtesy of both way below average graphics as well as locations and designs that just didn't lend much potential for looking good in the first place. The ending is pretty bad and just makes the rest of the story less interesting in hindsight. My biggest issue, however, is that the gameplay has too many issues, both major and minor, that pile up to make something that would make me think twice about wanting to fully replay it again. The game is insanely easy, with its kindergarten level platforming and combat, non-existent puzzles, and stages that feel like they should have more enemies or hazards but just don't for whatever reason. The motion controls, while not the worst considering it was a Wii launch title, have their fair share of tiring moments, just because they were constantly slapped in wherever, and a fair amount of those use cases are for mundane tasks that no one would care about. Sure, you could just play one of the other versions to avoid the Wii's Waggle, but all those switches and cranks are still there, so you're just stuck rotating the control stick or mashing buttons constantly, which isn't really any better. The collectibles are for incredibly specific rewards that most people won't care about, meaning replaying the game has no real value beyond the satisfaction you get from the stages themselves, which in a lot of cases won't be compelling enough. A common negative point I've seen brought up with this game is that it's way too short, and quite frankly, I disagree. For me, the game is way too long. Barring the last 2 levels, the shortest stages still go on for about 15 minutes, while the longest go up to an hour, and the gameplay is too shallow and boring to support levels that go on for that long. Even the better ones, like the Plankton levels, still kinda drag by the end, because you really are doing close to the same thing the whole way through. If this game was converted into having a larger amount of shorter stages, or had an actual difficulty curve, or better incentives to replay and get better at the game, or just more interesting mechanics and level design, I'd be singing a different tune. But as is, you could have cut an hour from this game, all of that ideally from the 3D platforming levels, and that alone would have likely raised my opinion of it from decent to pretty good. I do like Creature from the Krusty Krab, and I can totally understand why this would be someone's favorite SpongeBob game, and also why it's so nostalgic for a lot of people. If I had this game as a kid, I'd probably have nostalgia for it too. But even if I did, that wouldn't really change my final thoughts on the game now. It's decent. It's okay. It's got some great stuff mixed in with some really blah stuff, and even if those less than savory bits keep me from wanting to fully replay the game, I at least have the option to replay the good levels. I definitely like it more than Truth or Square, but it's not beating the movie game for me. The movie game definitely has the lower lows, but it also has much higher, much more common highs. But at least Creature doesn't feel like Diet Battle for the whole playthrough, so there's that. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and liking the video. I'm glad I could finally tackle this game that quite a few people had commented about. Hopefully this video delivered on that promise and I wasn't too harsh on it. And I do want to hear what you creature fans have to say about this one. At the very least, tell me your favorite and least favorite level from this game, because I'm curious which ones get brought up the most. This has been Baileography, and I wish you all my very best. Sure, the amount of what the fuck, what am I saying?